coworker harassed me over having implants. I outplayed her attempt and got her fired. 4 years ago, when I was 24, my mom died of breast cancer, and as both my grandmothers had also died of it, I saw a specialist for a screening. I discovered some cells in one of my breasts that could have turned cancerous. I was told I had a few options. 1. I could have regular screenings every 3 or 4 months until it does develop into cancer. I was told the risk of the cells becoming cancerous was very high due to family history, but it could also potentially never turn, so I'd just be getting these screenings for no reason. 2. I could get a single mastectomy on the breast with the bad cells, but they'd need to keep an eye on the other one, so I'd still need regular checkups for the other breast. 3. I could get a bilateral mastectomy and remove all my breast tissue, eliminating the risk. I went for a bilateral mastectomy. It was admittedly the most drastic option, but after seeing what cancer did to my mom and grandmother, I didn't want to risk it. I was warned about scarring, but told it should be pretty minor. It wasn't, and I was left with 2 huge, pink, jagged scars on either side of my chest, each about 1 inch long and half an inch wide. It caused me to go into a severe depression, where it got to the stage of me not even leaving my flat because I didn't want people to see me, throwing out my mirrors, and getting physically sick looking at myself. I went to a therapist who suggested a plastic surgeon. The therapist said they'd never usually do that, but I was struggling with it, and I might never get over it, and the therapist could see why I struggle with it. Although, I'll admit, the therapist did send me to ask about scar reduction. The plastic surgeon suggested a cream, a laser, or implants. The cream didn't work, and the laser was expensive and risky, so I went with the implants. I chose a slightly smaller DD because my natural boobs were at F cup. Since then, my mental health has improved, and I feel much better about my appearance. My confidence has gone up, as has my self-esteem. I know I shouldn't put so much into my appearance, but I wasn't exaggerating about these scars. Huge, bright pink, jagged rays, just really awful to look at, and I hated seeing myself. And they are now nicely hidden away, and you can barely feel them. In the present day, I'm 28 years old and working in an office. I'm doing a lot better than I was. My coworker Jill found out I'd had a boob job, but not about the cancer thing, when my friend from years before the mastectomy was planning a holiday, and she made a joke about me going on a plane with my implants, and Jill overheard. By the end of the day, the office knew I'd had a boob job, but not why, and half a dozen people confirmed Jill had told them. Over the next few months, Jill made many jokes and comments about my chest to coworkers when I was in earshot, at one point saying I had more plastic than Barbie, and calling me fake in 2 ways. I didn't hear this one myself, but a friend in the office told me that Jill had once referred to me as a sack of silicone. I don't know what her problem was precisely, but at one point she mentioned the NHS, so I assumed Jill thought that I'd got my tits done for free on taxpayer money, and to mention here I'd gotten the mastectomy on the NHS, but gone private for therapy and implants. I asked her to stop more than once, but unfortunately, the places I'd talked to her were places like the lift and the women's bathroom, where there weren't any cameras, and Jill just kept making comments no matter how often I asked her not to. I wouldn't say it was every single day, but I heard at least 3 comments per week for 3 months. I hit my breaking point when I and a few other coworkers were having lunch. I referred to something as being shallow, and Jill said, "You know all about being shallow," while gesturing to my chest. I snapped. I said, "Do you know why I have these? A few years ago, the doctors found potentially cancerous cells in my breast tissue. I was advised to get a mastectomy and was left with substantial, ugly scars on my chest. I went to see a therapist who sent me to a cosmetic surgeon who advised me to get implants to hide the scars, and I did so that I could look at myself in the mirror without crying. So maybe next time you want to judge someone for having cosmetic surgery, you should ask them why they had it first." And feeling like that was a mic drop moment, I picked up my food and left. For the rest of the day, I had about 1/3 of my office come up to me and offer support, and the rest told me that Jill was just joking around and I was being a bitch. I replied that Jill was being a bitch long before I was. I then got an email from HR saying they wanted to talk to me the following day, and when I called for clarification, They mentioned a hostile work environment. I knew the person who signed off the email, and I'd spoken to them. Her name was Debbie, and she was Jill's friend in HR, so I was pretty confident about who had reported me. I realized that if this was already being sent to HR, I needed as much ammunition as possible, so I went about collecting my information. As Debbie had dealt with me so far, it was safe to assume she would be the person reviewing the complaint with me, and if that was true, I was fucked. However, I vaguely remembered a complaint section that was in my contract when I first signed with the company. I flicked through the contract, and there was a part in the complaint section that said I was contractually allowed to request a reviewer change if I felt my allocated reviewer was biased. It was called an impartial overseer. I photocopied the page and highlighted that part. Then I messaged the people who had offered their support over Facebook and said, HR has asked to see me. Do any of you remember Jill insulting me to your face, and are you willing to write and sign something saying what you heard and when? Not everyone was willing to help, as Jill is somewhat feared in the office due to her befriending HR and management, but about 20 people were willing to help me. I guessed roughly when I'd asked Jill to stop and wrote them all down, along with a rough time of when the lunchroom confrontation happened and a list of names of who was there for the lunchroom confrontation. I got to work slightly early the following day. I went around everyone who had messaged me, and most of them managed to give me a printed and signed letter. Some didn't manage to write one, but not a big deal. These are exact words, as there are 16 letters to sum up here, but the gist was, my name is this. I work with Jill last name and OP. On this date at this time, I spoke with Jill, during which she referred to OP as the mentioned words. I felt this was inappropriate as it directly related to OP's appearance, and I am willing to go on record further to establish that Jill has been discussing OP in the workplace in the same manner for 3 months now, causing me discomfort and creating what I feel is a hostile work environment. And then they signed this application with their name. I wound up with about 16 letters, all from different people, and one of them was in the lunchroom for my conversation with Jill. Some even had bullet-pointed lists of everything Jill had said to them about me or other people. As it turns out, Jill has issues with many people's appearances. She commented about one coworker's weight and something anti-Semitic about a different coworker's nose, all of which were put in these letters. There are about 45 people in the office, so while 16 wasn't a majority, it's still a decent amount. The letters weren't hugely long. Most were only a paragraph, but they had all the necessary information. I was asked to come to HR at 10 a.m. I took the letters from coworkers, the photocopy of the page in my contract, and my dates and times in a little folder with me. I got there, and Debbie was the one overseeing the interview. She exited her desk, ready to lead me into another room. I immediately turned to the other HR worker and said, "So is my meeting with you then?" Debbie said, "No, you're with me." I replied that this wouldn't sit well with me, as my contract states I have a right to an impartial overseer, and as I said this, I took the contract page out of my folder. Debbie read it and said she could be impartial. I replied that I really didn't mean to be a pain, but I had it on good authority that the person on the other end of this complaint is her friend, and my contract to say I'm allowed an impartial overseer. Debbie stopped off to get the supervisor. The supervisor asks how I know she can't be impartial, and I tell him that I have it on good authority that Jill, who was on the other end of this complaint, is a close friend of Debbie. He asked Debbie if this was true, to which she only replied, "I can be impartial." The supervisor took a deep breath and asked the other HR representative to come with him, and the 4 of us reviewed the complaint. I thanked them for being so accommodating because I was worried I'd annoyed them. Debbie took out the complaint, and all 3 of them went through it with me. Debbie looked homicidal the whole time the interview happened, as she had anticipated firing me, or at least recommending I be fired. The interview went something like this. It took over half an hour, and they kept asking me the same questions but phrased in different ways, so this is a drastically condensed version. You said outside that you think Jill reported you. Why is this? Jill has had an issue with me for about 3 months now. Why didn't you come to us when you realized Jill had an issue? I had no issue with her. What issue does Jill have with you? 4 years ago, a specialist identified potentially cancerous cells in my breast tissue. I had surgery to remove my breast tissue, thereby removing the cells, and the risks. After the surgery, I was left with large scars on my chest. I went to a therapist for low self-esteem and depression. The therapist suggested a plastic surgeon who suggested breast implants to cover my scars. All of this is in my medical history, which you have a copy of in my file, and my full permission to review. Jill learned about my breast implants, but didn't know about the cancer. Jill had a problem with my breast implants and decided to communicate this problem to our coworkers. Why do you feel this is true? Here are 16 signed statements from different coworkers, all testifying that Jill told the entire office I'd had breast implants on the day she found out and has since commented about these implants frequently. They have quotes about what Jill said about it and rough dates and times. Rough dates and times. No one knew this would be escalated to such an extent, so no one took notes as to what had happened. What event or events do you think directly led to this complaint of harassment? For me, the harassment began when Jill told everyone about my breast implants without my consent, but as to the complaint against me, it would probably be what happened yesterday in the lunchroom. Jill commented on me being shallow while gesturing to my breasts, and I replied by giving her an abridged version of my relevant medical history and ending with a comment about the importance of getting the whole story. There are cameras in the lunchroom, so I'm sure you'll be able to find that conversation. I'll admit I could have handled the situation better, but after 3 months, I felt I had to put my foot down. Here's a list of names of people who were also present. There were 6 people at the table, including myself and Jill. One of these people is also in those letters and has written and signed their account of the conversation. Had you talked with Jill before this regarding her comments about you? Several, spaced out over the last 3 months. Each time, I communicated to her that I felt uncomfortable and upset with these comments she was making and would appreciate it if she were to stop. To your knowledge, was Jill made aware of your former cancer at any point? No, it wasn't mentioned in the conversation with my friend she overheard, and I didn't tell her because, frankly, it's none of her business. I did not feel the need to detail my medical history to a coworker to avoid further sexual harassment. The supervisor stands up and says, "Well, I think we're done here." He shakes my hand and sends me back to my desk, saying I'd hear from them after they reviewed the evidence, letters, CCTV, medical history, and anything they had already, and decided on a case. I returned to my desk, pulled up my CV, and prepared to start the job search again. About an hour goes by, and then the people who wrote the letter and were there for the lunchroom conversation get called for a meeting with HR. They come back 10 minutes later. Except for Jill, the other people who were also there for the lunchroom conversation get called individually. All of them are gone for about 10 minutes, then come back, find a coworker, and say that HR wants to see them. By about 3:30, it looked like everyone who wrote a letter or was there in the lunchroom had been interviewed. Then, finally, Jill gets called in. She's gone for about 30 minutes and comes back fuming. She glares at me while I work, but I ignore her. At 4:30, Jill gets called into HR again. 5 p.m. rolls around, and everyone is either leaving or getting ready to leave when Jill storms back into the office. She glares at me the whole time she packs up her desk. She then tells anyone who will listen that I got her fired before shoving her onto the lift. An email comes in from HR. My case is closed. So, people, that's one story, yet this happens daily in offices. As the OP said, knowing the reason is better before trolling someone for something. Those implants were definitely for her mental health and physical appearance, and even if she had them for purely cosmetic reasons, it was no reason to harass her in such a humiliating way. Well, I think Jill now has the taste of her own actions and won't ever do the same again. An attorney's dream case, my parents versus the bank. This story has a twist, so wait till the end. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage, and the bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. As it turns out, Bob was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the work. The bill took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not discussing the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to erase a line on the blueprints, and the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told, "Don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets," because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway, and so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Bob's work. Then the representative became angry, as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob. After that, the entire door with the casing fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Bob wasn't better at building a house than his minions. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a stay-at-home mother in a nasty rental with 2 tiny children while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the process, the bank and Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot. My dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. So, my exhausted parents went to an attorney and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, and tiling issues. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank and Bob would win. The attorney said Tom was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then, abruptly, Tom smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents. "Tomorrow." So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else starts to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" In a sweeping, theatrical gesture, Tom placed a deed on the table. "My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." Bob's attorney stared at the deed and then turned and stared at Bob. "You built a house on land you don't own?" Bob nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on." The representative stammered, No." Tom said firmly, "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state, at once." My dad said he'd remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant lousy credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment, but to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to replace or repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people. It was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank and Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was immediately brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications, at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Bob. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. Before you question this tale, please remember that 1973 was 50 years ago. Banks did things differently back then. Smaller rural banks, particularly, were not run like the bigger city banks. There were far fewer federal regulations, and in a smaller community, people didn't always follow them. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Yes, they built a wall through the bathtub. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunch bag on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the bag, so he left it there and built the rest of the cabinet around it. I don't know where Bob found these people, but they were gems, every one of them. I must admit that I'm immensely surprised at the traction this story has gotten. The bank and Bob put together very poorly written and pretty much unenforceable contracts. The OP's parents' attorney figured this out and the bank and Bob had to back off. I thought this was interesting, but surely not the one and only time this happened. Aren't contracts being written all the time by clueless people? Is this really that unique? I guess we should be glad it is.